What would you do if the man who once threw you out called you a witch, only to return years later, begging for food at the door of the family you built without him? Monday mornings at the Langston house didn't begin with peace. They began with smoke alarms and power struggles. Edward Langston, CEO of Langston Developments and one of the most respected builders in the state, was currently losing a battle with toast, a battle with eggs, and most of all, a battle with two small, determined children. The kitchen was an absolute mess. Scrambled eggs bubbled like a science experiment gone wrong. The toaster belched smoke. The kettle shrieked. Juice had soaked into his shirt, and for some reason, one of his socks was stuck to the fridge. "Kids, breakfast is almost ready," Edward shouted, hair wild, face flushed, spatula in hand like a knight with a broken sword. Silence. Then came the stomp, stomp, stomp of twin feet pounding the hallway. "I say we wear pink today," declared Sophie Langston, 7 years old, wearing a pink skirt and oversized sunglasses like she was heading to a fashion shoot. "No way," said her twin brother Caleb, holding up a blue t-shirt. "Blue is for warriors. We wore blue yesterday. We'll wear it again today. I'm older. By 5 minutes. I'm the second man in this house." Their voices clashed like drums. Edward groaned. "Guys, sit down. Eat something before I throw myself in the dishwasher." The twins marched to the table, still bickering. Edward placed plates of eggs, toast, and fruit in front of them with a tired kind of pride. "Voila!" Made with love and desperation. They each took a bite. Sophie blinked. "Daddy, your eggs taste..." Confused. Caleb winced. "It's like a pepper explosion." Edward collapsed into the chair across from them. "You two scared off the last 3 nannies. I'm doing my best here." Caleb folded his napkin like a judge. "They didn't get us. We're special." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Says who?" "You do," they said in unison. "Every day, every morning, even this morning," he sighed. "Okay, fine. You're special. But even special people have to clean their rooms and eat breakfast." The kids nodded, like little monarchs granting a favor. Then came the next war, dressing for school. Sophie screamed when he brushed her hair too hard. Caleb cried foul when his shoelaces were tied differently than his old nanny used to do it. By the time Edward dropped them off, he looked like he'd survived a hurricane in a business suit. He dragged himself into the office at 9:12 a.m., loosened his tie, and flopped into his chair like he'd just climbed a mountain. Renee Carter, his assistant, entered with her tablet. "Your noon meeting's been moved. The clients had to fly to DC for a family emergency." "Bless them," Edward muttered. "I'm too tired to pretend I'm functioning," Renee chuckled. "Rough morning? I fought 2 tigers in my own house. Still no nanny? Nope, and I'm not calling that agency again. I need someone real, someone who can handle chaos with calm and maybe teach manners to my little royal disasters." Renee tapped her chin. "I might know someone, but I'm not sure she'll say yes." "I'll pay anything," Edward said, eyes closing. "Name your miracle." Renee grinned. "What you need isn't a nanny. You need a miracle worker. Or a girlfriend." He pointed to the door. "Out." As the door closed, Edward leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Does someone like that even exist? Meanwhile, across town, in a quiet apartment that smelled of boiled yam and sorrow, Ruth Delaney lay flat on her back, eyes locked on the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her. Each turn of the blade felt like time mocking her. Slow, silent. Stuck. She had once mattered. Her voice moved projects. Her signature unlocked budgets. She had been a respected state-level project manager, sharp heels, crisp blazers, emails that made men sit up straight. Then came marriage. Then came Elijah Warren. "Resign," he had pleaded. "Let's build our home together." "I make enough." And when Ruth hesitated, his mother, Clara, tightened the noose. "All this work is what's blocking your womb," she had said. Big jobs don't make babies. So Ruth resigned. She gave up everything: her income, her identity, her rhythm. And what did she get in return? Empty calabash. Dry land, useless housewife. That was her daily soundtrack. Ruth didn't cry anymore. She just lay there, not sleeping, not dreaming, just waiting. Then the phone rang. It was Renee, her best friend, her only friend. "Hey, babe," Renee said gently. "Still looking for a job?" Ruth sat up, instantly alert. "Yes, anything. Even washing windows." "Well," Renee said slowly, "my boss is looking for a live-in nanny for his twins." Ruth's eyes widened. "Children?" "Yes, wild ones," Renee replied with a chuckle. "But he'll pay well, and you need a way out." Ruth didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. This wasn't about a job. It was about survival. And though she didn't know it yet, that phone call would be the first step toward reclaiming everything she'd lost and discovering something she'd never had before. Not a career, not a title, but a home. Ruth Delaney stood outside the glass entrance of Langston Tower, clutching a thin brown folder like it contained her entire future. Because it did. The building loomed over her, a shining monument to power, order, and ambition. She took one breath, then another. She whispered a short prayer under her breath. Inside, the air was crisp, perfumed with money and precision. Men in suits walked past her without a glance. Receptionists clicked on keyboards with military rhythm. It had been years since Ruth felt this small, but she straightened her back. She had worn her cleanest blouse, pressed her pants 3 times, tied her scarf tight like armor. She wasn't here to look desperate. She was here to be chosen. The elevator ride felt eternal. By the time she stepped onto the top floor, her palms were damp. Her legs shook beneath her, but she kept walking straight to the oak door marked Edward Langston, CEO. She knocked gently. A voice inside answered, deep and flat. "Come in." She stepped in. The office was massive. A wall of windows behind him flooded the space with light. The desk could have hosted a Thanksgiving dinner. Edward Langston sat behind it, typing, not looking up. "Have a seat," he said, eyes still on the screen. Ruth sat carefully, folder clutched like a lifeline. There was silence. Keys clicked. The air conditioner hummed. Then, still without looking at her, he asked, "So, you're good with children?" "Yes, sir," she answered quickly. Her voice cracked a little. "Do you have any certifications in childcare or early education?" Ruth blinked. The question caught her off guard. "No, sir," she said honestly, "but I've raised 5 younger siblings. I've taught Sunday school for over 20 years. I've cared for children with fevers, tantrums, and broken hearts. No certificate has ever prepared anyone for that." Edward paused. Then finally he looked up. His eyes met hers, and for a brief second, Ruth saw something unexpected. Not suspicion, not cold judgment, but curiosity. He closed his laptop, folded his hands. "My assistant says good things about you." "She's my best friend," Ruth said quietly. "She's seen me at my worst. And still believes I can be useful." Edward leaned back in his chair. He studied her face. The tiredness, the quiet dignity, the way she was trying so hard not to look afraid. "Ms. Delaney," he said at last, "my children have driven out 15 nannies in 3 years. They are not easy." "I'm not expecting them to be," Ruth said. "I don't want someone who yells or runs or cries in the laundry room. I don't do any of those." "Not anymore." A silence settled. Then Edward nodded slowly. "All right." "I'll give you a chance." Ruth's breath caught. "Starting salary, 5,000 per month. I'll send over the contract with specific terms." "You'll live in. You'll have your own room. Your job is not just to keep them alive, but to give them some kind of stability." "Think you're up for that?" Yes, sir, she said, standing abruptly, almost knocking the chair over. Thank you, sir, truly. I won't let you down. Edward didn't smile, but his eyes softened, just a little. As Ruth walked out of that office, a tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear, not from humiliation, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. That night, back at the apartment she now called a cage, Ruth returned to find her husband, Elijah Warren, sprawled on the couch like a man who had done battle with gravity and lost. His attention was fixed on the TV, a football game blaring. I got the job, Ruth said, standing by the doorway, still holding her file. He mumbled. I got hired. I'm going to work as a nanny. His eyes didn't leave the screen. He popped peanuts into his mouth like she was talking about the weather. So now you're good enough to care for other people's kids, he said flatly. But not to have your own. Isn't that something? It hit her like a slap. Not because it was new, but because it never stopped hurting. Ruth didn't argue. She didn't cry. She turned and walked into the bedroom, closed the door behind her. That night, she didn't sleep. She ironed her clothes in silence, packed her small travel bag, folded her church scarf neatly. She wasn't going to a job. She was walking into a new version of herself. The next morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., Ruth arrived at the Langston mansion. From the outside, it looked like something out of a magazine. Large white pillars, silver gates, a yard trimmed with surgical precision. But inside, there were storms. As soon as she stepped into the foyer, the twins were already yelling. I don't want cereal again. My bunny is missing. I told you not to touch my iPad. They didn't notice her. She walked in quietly, set her bag down, and took a deep breath. This was it. The battlefield, and she wasn't a maid, she was a soldier. A quiet one, but a soldier nonetheless. And the war for peace in this house. It had just begun. The first thing Ruth Delaney noticed when she entered the Langston mansion wasn't the marble floors or the designer furniture, it was the silence. The kind of silence that felt like a trap. She stepped into the grand foyer, her shoes making the softest clicks against polished stone. Her travel bag sat by her side like a soldier's gear. She adjusted her scarf, drew in a breath, and waited. Then came the sound of tiny footsteps, fast, uneven, and dangerous. Sophie and Caleb Langston appeared at the top of the staircase like royalty surveying their kingdom. Both were dressed in matching pajamas and holding iPads like shields. They didn't say a word, just stared. Ruth offered a warm smile. Good morning, she said gently. I'm Ruth. I'll be helping out around the house. Silence. Sophie blinked once. Caleb scratched his head. Then, without a word, they turned around and disappeared down the hallway. No welcome, no eye contact. Just gone, Ruth sighed. So this is how it's going to be. By breakfast, she'd learned 3 things. 1. Caleb had a habit of hiding one shoe in the freezer. 2. Sophie claimed to be allergic to anything green, including parsley and logic. 3. Both were trained in psychological warfare. She placed a plate of pancakes in front of them. They looked at it like it was poisoned. Sophie sniffed. Did you use the blue syrup or the pink one? I used maple syrup, Ruth replied kindly. That's boring, Caleb announced, pushing his plate 2 inches away. Ruth didn't flinch. Boring is good for your brain. Sophie rolled her eyes. You're not like Miss Peace. She made chocolate chip pancakes shaped like ponies. I'm not Miss Peace, Ruth said. I'm Ruth. Caleb took one bite and spat it into his napkin with dramatic flair. This tastes like old people. Ruth smiled thinly. You'll live. Edward stood by the staircase, sipping his morning coffee, watching it all unfold like a spectator in a Roman Colosseum. He winced as Sophie spilled juice onto the tablecloth, and Caleb pretended his fork was a helicopter. She lasted longer than the last one, he murmured, taking a sip. Still, something about Ruth's energy was different. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't beg, she didn't threaten. She just stood there calmly, mopping up spilled juice and asking Caleb politely to please keep the silverware out of his nose. By lunchtime, Ruth had negotiated 2 sandwich bites and 1 carrot into their bellies. A small miracle. By 3 p.m., she had lost track of Sophie in the backyard for 15 minutes, only to find her behind a tree, trying to feed grapes to a squirrel. By 4:30, Caleb had declared he was running away to start a new life in the basement. And by 7 p.m., Ruth had a headache so deep she was convinced it was spiritual. When Edward came home from work, he found her sitting on the edge of the living room couch, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The twins were upstairs, quiet for the first time all day. "Rough first day?" he asked. Ruth opened her eyes slowly. "Let's just say, I met the dragons," he chuckled. "Most people don't make it past breakfast." "I'm not most people." Edward raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." She stood up slowly, stretched her back, and gathered a pile of toys from the floor. "I'll clean up before I go to bed." "You don't have to," he said. Ruth looked at him. "I need to. It helps me think." Edward nodded and walked toward the kitchen. He paused before exiting the room. "They're not bad kids. Just wounded." "I know," she said. "I see it in their eyes." That night, alone in her guest room, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands ached. Her scarf was undone. Her soul felt scraped raw, but she smiled. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't invisible. Someone had looked her in the eye, spoken to her with respect. Let her try, and that was enough for now. She leaned back against the pillows and whispered to herself, "They may be little dragons, but I've survived bigger beasts." Meanwhile, in the twins' bedroom upstairs, Sophie whispered under the covers, "Do you think she'll run away like the others?" Caleb shrugged. "Maybe." "She didn't cry when I threw the juice. She didn't even yell when I hid her phone in the laundry." They were silent for a moment. Then Sophie said, "She smells like pancakes and something warm." Caleb yawned. "Like Grandma's house before she died." Sophie rolled over, pulling her bunny close. "Maybe we won't be mean tomorrow." "Let's see if she lasts the week," Caleb mumbled. And then they drifted to sleep. Downstairs, Ruth had just finished folding the last throw blanket on the couch. She stood in the middle of the quiet house, looking around. It wasn't hers, but it could be something more important than ownership. It could be peace. And if she had to fight for it, she was ready. By the 3rd day, Ruth Delaney had stopped trying to win the twins with sweetness. She had offered them kindness. They'd sneered. She'd cooked with love. They'd spat it out. She'd told bedtime stories. They'd stayed up making fart noises under the blanket, so she changed tactics. On day 4, while Sophie and Caleb were at school, Ruth stood in the center of their room and looked around like a general planning her counterattack. Then she went to work. She didn't yell, didn't threaten. She just packed every toy, every game. Every iPad, gadget, stuffed animal, remote-controlled car, rubber duck, sparkly pen, and music box. All of it went into a giant blanket bag. She zipped it shut and pushed it under the bed. Then she vacuumed the floor, dusted the shelves, smoothed the blankets on their little beds like she was preparing a trap. When she was done, she stood back, hands on hips, and whispered, "Let's see how clever you are now." That afternoon, the twins came home full of stories and energy, tossing their school bags on the floor and racing upstairs. 3 seconds later, chaos erupted. "My bunny!" Sophie screamed, like someone had stolen her heart. My race car is gone, Caleb shouted. Where's my iPad? Where's my stuff? The sound of feet thundered back down the stairs as they rushed into the living room, eyes wide with panic. Miss Ruth? Our things are gone, Caleb cried. We've been robbed, Sophie added, dramatically clutching her chest. Ruth sat calmly on the couch, sipping juice and watching a game show like nothing had happened. Robbed? She repeated, eyes wide with mock concern. Oh dear. Yes, someone must have broken in, Caleb said. Our whole room is empty. Ruth stood, set her glass down, and clapped her hands together. Then we should call the police, she said seriously, pulling out her phone. Sophie gasped. The police? Well, Ruth said, dialing, we have a theft on our hands, don't we? Missing property, devastated children. A clear emergency. She placed the call to Renee, who had agreed to play along. Yes, officer, Ruth said into the phone, pacing slowly. I'm calling to report a home invasion. The children's toys are gone. Yes, they're very distraught. Uh-huh, what? Oh. Next week? That long, I see. Thank you. She ended the call and turned to them. They said they're busy with more serious crimes. They'll come next week. Next week! Sophie shrieked. I can't sleep without my bunny. We want our stuff back now, Caleb added. Ruth folded her arms and nodded. All right. Let's do a full house search. But first, she paused, their eyes locked on hers. If I'm going to help you, we need to agree on something. Sophie frowned. What kind of something? No more pouring juice on the carpet? No more throwing pancakes at the wall? No more hiding my things or calling me weird names? And no more skipping meals because you think the food smells too normal? Deal? The twins looked at each other. Caleb hesitated. Do we still get snack time? If you behave, yes. Sophie folded her arms. And bedtime stories? If you brush your teeth. After a moment, Caleb nodded. Fine. Deal. Sophie sighed. Deal. Ruth smiled. Good. Let's go find those toys. They searched the entire mansion like detectives in a mystery movie. Under the couch, behind the curtains, in the dryer. Caleb even looked inside the fridge. Sophie poked around the garage and emerged covered in cobwebs. Finally, Ruth walked into their room, knelt down and peeked under the bed. I think I found something. The twins dropped to their knees beside her. She pulled out the giant blanket bag and slowly unzipped it. There they were, every toy, every gadget, every stuffed companion and lost charger. My bunny, Sophie cried, hugging it like it had returned from war. My iPad, Caleb shouted with joy. They turned to Ruth with wide eyes. Did you find the thief? Sophie asked. I think the thief was careless and left it all right here, Ruth said, raising an eyebrow. Imagine that. They didn't press further. They were too relieved. But something had changed. Their eyes were softer, their voices calmer. That night, they ate their dinner without complaint. Ruth made them spaghetti and meatballs, and Caleb actually said thank you before asking for seconds. Sophie asked her to braid her hair after dinner, sitting silently while Ruth worked the comb through each tangled strand. And when Sophie tilted her head and asked, Do you have kids? Ruth froze for a second. She answered gently, No, sweetheart, not yet. Why? The little girl asked innocently. Ruth smiled, but her eyes dimmed just a little. Sometimes life doesn't go the way we want, but that doesn't mean it's over. Sophie nodded like she understood something deep and adult. I think you'd be a great mom, she whispered. Ruth's hand paused in mid-braid. She blinked, and for the first time in a very, very long time, she believed that might be true. That night, Edward walked past the twins' bedroom and paused. He peeked in through the cracked door. Both children were asleep, peaceful, quiet, tucked in under matching blankets. Ruth sat in the rocking chair near the window, watching them, her hands folded on her lap. She looked up and met his eyes. No words were exchanged. Just a small nod, a mutual recognition. Something was shifting in this house. Not fast, but real. The Langston mansion had begun to breathe differently. Mornings came with fewer tantrums. Evenings echoed with soft giggles and bedtime songs. Ruth Delaney had not only survived her first weeks, he'd begun to create something rare in that house. Peace. Edward noticed it in the silence during his conference calls. In the thank you notes the kids left in their lunchboxes. In the way Sophie rested her head on Ruth's shoulder without fear. In the way Caleb didn't cling to his iPad, but to stories read aloud in a warm, steady voice. But while one home healed, another was unraveling. Because the ghosts Ruth had escaped weren't finished with her. Not yet. It began one Thursday evening. Ruth returned from the market, grocery bag in hand, humming softly. She had just taught Sophie how to roll puff pastry that afternoon, and Caleb had surprised her with a drawing of the three of them labeled "My Family" in shaky crayon letters. Her heart was full. Until she opened the door to her old apartment. A woman in bright red lace sat on her couch like she owned it. Legs crossed, lips pursed, flipping through a magazine she hadn't paid for. Ruth froze. And then, like a scene from a nightmare, Clara Warren, her mother-in-law, appeared from the hallway. Scarf high, arms folded, eyes sharpened like blades. "Oh, good," Clara said sweetly, venom in every syllable. "You're back. Come greet your sister." "My... who?" Ruth asked. "Your co-wife," Clara declared. The words felt like ash in her mouth. "I told you, Ruth. I will not let my son's destiny rot in your barren hands." "This one here," she gestured proudly to the woman in red. "She's fertile. Her womb is vibrating with favor." Just then, Elijah walked in, holding a bag of suya and chewing slowly like nothing was out of place. Ruth turned to him, eyes searching for reason. For humanity. He didn't look at her. "You heard, Mama?" "Either you stay and bear it, or leave." No thunder crashed. No lights flickered. The world just stilled. Ruth said nothing. That night she slept under the same roof as her replacement. Walked past her in the hallway, cooked while the new bride giggled behind her, washed clothes while Clara praised the new girl for walking like a real woman. Each day was another insult. Another pebble on the pile of grief Ruth carried. But she stayed, because she had nowhere else to go. Not yet. One afternoon, weeks later, Ruth came back from the farmer's market with fresh vegetables and spices in her bag. The sky was soft and blue, like the world was trying to apologize. But when she reached her gate, something was wrong. Her bags were outside, lined up. Neat, deliberate, final. She knocked, once, twice. The door opened just enough for Clara's face to appear. "Ah, you're back," she said, grinning. "Good." "My pastor came last night. We did deliverance." Ruth's heart thudded. "He confirmed what I always suspected," Clara continued. "You are a witch. That's why the new girl isn't pregnant yet. You're poisoning her womb." Ruth stood frozen. The sun still shined, but her world dimmed. "Take your things and go," Clara said, "before your spirit finishes her off." And then she shut the door. No apology. No explanation. No Elijah. Just the sound of the bolt locking her out of a life she once bled to build. Ruth stood there, staring at the wood grain of the door for 10 long minutes. Then she bent down, picked up her bags, and walked away. No one stopped her. No one said her name. That was how a wife became a stranger. A woman who once brought light to a home reduced to a shadow with luggage. She didn't call Edward. She called Renee, and when Renee opened her front door and saw Ruth dusty, sweaty, broken, she didn't ask a single question. She just pulled her in and hugged her tight. "Sit down," Renee whispered. "Do you want tea? Or tears first?" Ruth collapsed into her friend's arms, dropping everything. "I gave them everything," she whispered.
My name, my womb, my peace.
And now I'm the witch they blame for their failure. Renee kissed her forehead. They will beg. God is still alive. Ruth didn't go to work the next day.
She sent Edward a text. Family emergency. I'm sorry, sir. I need a day. He replied within seconds. Take your time. Let me know if you need anything. But Ruth didn't need groceries. She didn't need rent. She needed to feel human again.
She stayed at Renee's for a week, barely spoke, ate little.
Slept like the dead. Her hair grew wild. Her spirit shriveled.
But she didn't collapse. She was too used to pain for that. Then, one quiet evening, someone rang the doorbell. Renee opened it. Edward Langston stood there with Sophie and Caleb. The moment the kids saw Ruth, they screamed, "Miss Ruth!" They ran to her and wrapped their arms around her waist like she was the only safe place left in the world. "You look like a zombie," Caleb said. "Are you sick?"
Are you hurt? Sophie asked, tears in her eyes. We miss you. We haven't eaten in 1 year, Caleb added dramatically. Ruth laughed through her tears.
"I'll make noodles," she whispered. And she did. They devoured it like prisoners who had finally escaped. Edward pulled her aside. "I heard what happened," he said gently. "I'm sorry, Ruth."
Really? We're here if you need us. She nodded. He hesitated.
"Are you planning to go back?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "There's nothing left there. Where will you stay?" "I'll get a small apartment. Start over." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Why don't you stay with us? At least for now. Save your money. Regain your peace." Ruth opened her mouth to protest. He raised a hand. "Forget what people will say. You deserve a place to rest. You've earned it." Sophie peeked into the kitchen. "Can we sleep here tonight?" "No," Edward called. "School tomorrow, time to go." But as they left, Sophie looked back and blew Ruth a kiss. And in that quiet apartment, with tears still drying on her face, Ruth sat by the window and thought about beginnings, about endings, about how sometimes being thrown out is the only way to finally walk through the right door. At exactly 11:32 p.m., she picked up her phone, typed one line, "I'll move in tomorrow," and hit send. When Ruth Delaney stepped out of the cab in front of the Langston estate that Friday morning, she didn't look like a maid reporting for duty. She looked like a woman coming home, not because the sprawling mansion belonged to her, not because her name was on any deed, but because for the first time in years, she was walking into a place where her presence was not only tolerated, but wanted. She held a small duffel bag in one hand and a paper bag of cinnamon rolls in the other. Her scarf was pinned neatly, her shoulders were square, her eyes steady. The gate buzzed open. She walked through. Edward met her at the door, dressed casually, holding a mug of coffee. No words were exchanged, just a quiet nod. Sophie and Caleb came tumbling down the stairs in pajamas, arms outstretched like puppies who'd found their favorite person again. "You're really back?" Sophie asked, eyes wide. "For now," Ruth said with a soft smile. "For always," Caleb insisted, grabbing her hand. Ruth ruffled his hair. "We'll see." The guest room Edward assigned her wasn't tucked away like a servant's quarters. It sat just down the hall from the children's rooms, bright, sunlit, and freshly painted. Someone had even left a vase of lilies on the nightstand. Ruth ran her fingers along the windowsill. Clean, cared for. It didn't feel like charity, it felt like respect. That evening, she made dinner rosemary chicken with mashed potatoes and buttered green beans. The kids licked their plates. Edward had 2 helpings. "You could open a restaurant," he said. "I did think about it once," Ruth replied, wiping her hands. Sophie leaned across the table. "If you open a restaurant, can we work there? I'll be the boss." "I'll be the cashier," Caleb added. "You'll both be in school," Ruth laughed. "Where you belong."
Living at the mansion changed everything, not because of the luxury, but because of the rhythm. Ruth woke up before sunrise, prepped lunches, ironed uniforms, brushed Sophie's hair with care, helped Caleb with his math homework. She became the heart of the home, quiet, steady, ever-present. And slowly, Edward began to shift too. He came home earlier, ate at the table instead of in his office, sat on the floor to help with puzzles, laughed when Sophie told silly stories, listened when Ruth suggested bedtime routines or discipline ideas. He wasn't just managing his house anymore. He was fathering again. One rainy Saturday, as the wind howled against the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, the four of them sat around the fireplace in fuzzy socks. Caleb was drawing. Sophie was curled up with a book. Edward looked across the room at Ruth, who was sewing a button onto Sophie's jacket. "You know," he said quietly, "the last time this house felt like a home was before their mother died." Ruth paused, needle in hand. Edward continued, "I thought peace died with her, that all I had left was chaos." Ruth didn't answer right away. Then she looked up. "Sometimes peace doesn't come back the same way. Sometimes it arrives in a new shape." A different face. Edward nodded. "You've brought something into this house, Ruth. Not just order, not just routine, but healing." Ruth swallowed hard. "That's what I needed too," she said. By the end of the month, the children had stopped calling her Miss Ruth. Now it was just Ruth, or Mom Ruth, when they forgot. She never corrected them. But even in warmth, scars have memory. One afternoon, Ruth overheard Caleb telling a friend from school, "This is my mom now. My real one is in heaven, but God sent Ruth." She smiled from the hallway, then cried alone in her room. Not from sadness, but from the impossible kindness of children. One night, Edward found her in the backyard, staring at the stars. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm learning how to exhale again," she replied. He stood beside her in silence. Then asked, "Do you think about going back to your old life?" Ruth shook her head. "There's nothing left to go back to. That house was never mine. That marriage was a funeral in slow motion." Edward looked at her carefully. "Then maybe this can be a rebirth." She didn't answer. But in the quiet, the word maybe floated in the air like a promise not yet spoken. A few days later, Sophie fell ill with a fever. Ruth didn't sleep. She sat by her bedside all night, cooling her with cloths, whispering songs, monitoring her breath. When Edward saw her in the morning, eyes tired, hair uncombed, he said, "You didn't have to stay up." "I did," she replied. "I'm not just their nanny anymore." Edward looked at her like he already knew. And for the first time in a long, long time, so did Ruth. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the knock came. Not urgent, not angry, just persistent. Ruth Delaney was in the kitchen, humming softly as she sliced strawberries for the kids' lunchboxes. The Langston home, now filled with the comforting sounds of clinking dishes and soft laughter, felt as safe as a sanctuary. Until that knock. She wiped her hands, walked to the front door and opened it. And froze. There he was, Elijah Warren. The man who had once begged her to quit her job. The man who stood by while his mother called her barren, a witch, a burden. The man who had watched in silence as she packed her things and walked away from the house they had once called a home. Now he stood on Edward Langston's porch in an ill-fitting shirt, holding a plastic bag, eyes darting nervously. "Ruth," he said, voice low. I didn't know where else to go." She didn't speak. "Mama's gone to the village for a few weeks. And the new girl, she left." Ruth tilted her head slightly. "She left. She took her things." "Said she wasn't called to suffer," Elijah muttered. "She's not pregnant yet, and Mama..." Well, Mama blames me now. Ruth blinked slowly. He wasn't here for her. He was here because he was alone. I remembered you work here, he added, almost as an afterthought. Figured maybe you had some food, or time to talk. Ruth stepped back, letting the moment stretch long and silent between them. I don't have food for you, she said calmly. Ruth, please, I haven't eaten today. I'm not the person you abandoned, she said. I'm not the woman who boiled water while being insulted. I'm not the ghost who slept in your house. His mouth opened, but no words came. I'm someone now, Ruth continued, her voice steady. I belong, I'm loved, and I don't owe you anything. Just then, Sophie's voice rang out from upstairs. Ruth, we're going to be late for school. Elijah looked past her, his expression shifting. He saw it, the clean walls, the polished staircase, the air of order and care. A home, and he didn't belong there, not anymore. I should go, he mumbled. Ruth nodded. Yes. You should. He turned, walked down the steps slowly, his shoulders hunched against the morning sun. She closed the door, and this time it felt like a door closing in her heart, but not from pain. From release. Later that evening, Edward returned from work and found Ruth in the backyard, trimming a small herb garden with Sophie. You okay? He asked gently. Yes, she said, then paused. Elijah came today. Edward raised his eyebrows but said nothing. He looked lost, Ruth admitted. He asked for food and pity. Did you give him either? No, she said firmly. I gave him clarity, Edward smiled slightly. Good. He saw the kids, heard Sophie call my name like I belonged. I think that was enough of an answer. Edward stepped closer. You do belong. Ruth didn't respond right away. She plucked a sprig of rosemary and held it between her fingers. Then softly she said, It's strange. The person who once convinced me to abandon everything came back with nothing. And yet here I am, building something new. Edward looked at her for a long moment. You're not just building something new, Ruth. You're becoming someone new. That night, as the rain gently tapped the windows, Ruth sat in her room and stared at a photographone she had almost thrown away years ago. It was a picture of her in a suit, standing in front of a government building, a folder in one hand and confidence in her eyes. She remembered that woman, and for the first time, she no longer mourned her, because that woman wasn't gone. She had evolved, grown, survived. Meanwhile, in the Langston children's room, Caleb whispered. The days after Elijah's unexpected visit passed like gentle waves quiet, rhythmic, full of small, meaningful moments. Ruth Delaney returned to her routines. Sophie's breakfast smoothie with extra banana, Caleb's bedtime joke of the day, and Edward's nightly check-in, which had slowly shifted from, how are the kids, to, how are you doing, Ruth? She felt safe again. But safety, she had learned, was not the same as peace. Because even when the world outside had calmed, Ruth's heart still carried echoes. And peace wasn't something you found, it was something you chose, again and again. One morning, Ruth was packing the twins' lunches when Caleb walked into the kitchen with a notebook. Miss Ruth, he said, sitting beside her, do you think witches are real? She paused. Why do you ask? Someone at school said that if a woman can't have babies, it's because she's cursed, like a witch or something. Ruth set down the peanut butter knife. Her hands were still. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Do you think I'm a witch, Caleb? He blinked. No, you're the best person in the world. You make pancakes. And fix nightmares. Ruth smiled softly. Then maybe, she said, your friend at school hasn't learned the truth yet. What truth? That people are more than what they can or can't do. That being a mum isn't just about having babies. It's about loving, and staying, and listening when no one else does. Caleb nodded slowly. Then you're definitely a mom." She reached out and hugged him gently, and in that moment, a healing happened inside her that no medicine, no sermon, no justice had ever delivered. A child had undone a curse that society had spoken over her for years with one simple sentence. Later that afternoon, as Edward and Ruth sat in the backyard watching the twins race through sprinklers in their school uniforms, he glanced over and said, "You've changed them." "They've changed me too," Ruth said. "They used to break things when they were upset. Now they just talk." "You used to hide in your office," she added, smiling. He chuckled. "Touché." There was a pause. Then Edward leaned forward. His voice dropped slightly. "Ruth, have you ever thought about staying?" She turned to him, cautious. "You mean staying longer than just helping around the house?" "I mean staying as part of it," he said, eyes steady. She didn't answer right away, because somewhere inside her, the old Ruth, the Ruth who had been betrayed, abandoned, mocked, stood up and whispered, "Don't fall for softness. It never lasts." But another voice, quieter, wiser, whispered back, "What if this time it's different?" That night, Ruth tucked Sophie into bed. The little girl reached up and touched her cheek. "If you ever leave again, I'll come find you," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere," Ruth replied.
"Promise?" "Promise." Caleb was already snoring, one sock off, his race car clutched like treasure. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, then turned off the light. In her room, a knock came. Edward. He held 2 mugs of tea. "Thought you might need a warm drink." She smiled, took the cup, and stepped aside to let him in. They didn't sit close. They didn't talk much. Just sipped in quiet companionship. After a while, Edward said, "I keep thinking about something Sophie said earlier." "What was it?" "She told me that when you hug her, it feels like her mom never left." Ruth looked down, blinking fast. Edward added, "She doesn't remember much about her mother. Just feelings, warmth, calm." "You gave that back to her." Ruth set her tea down. "You're a good father, Edward." "Not always, but I'm learning." "And I'm healing," Ruth said. He stood then, slowly, paused at the door. "If you ever want more than a room here, the offer stands." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Ruth closed the door behind him, stood there a long time, then whispered to herself, "Maybe this time it is different." It had been 3 months since Ruth Delaney moved into the Langston home, and with each passing day, her presence no longer felt like support, it felt like foundation. The twins no longer asked if Ruth would be there in the morning, they simply assumed she always would. Edward no longer checked the house calendar for childcare rotations. He simply asked, "Ruth, what's the plan today?" But Ruth still reminded herself every night, as she folded clothes or packed school bags, "This is temporary. I'm not part of this family. I'm just helping." It was her defense, her shield. Because if she admitted the truth that this had become her home, that these children were hers in every way but blood, that Edward made her heart feel something she didn't dare name, then she'd have something to lose again. And Ruth had already lost enough. Then came the day everything changed. A crisp Sunday morning. The twins were off at a playdate, the house unusually quiet. Ruth was in the kitchen, kneading dough, sleeves rolled, soft music playing through the speaker. Edward walked in, holding 2 coffee mugs and something folded under his arm. "A peace offering," he said, handing her the mug. She smiled. "You didn't start another kitchen fire, did you?" "Not yet." He unfolded what he was holding, papers, legal papers. She tilted her head. "What's that?" Edward cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. You've built this home with me. You've done more for Sophie and Caleb than anyone since their mother passed. You've rebuilt all of us." Ruth looked down, unsure where this was going. "So," he continued, "I'd like to officially make you their legal guardian. alongside me. Not as a nanny, but as their parent. Ruth froze. For a moment, the only sound was the dough being kneaded under her palms. "You want what?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I want to share custody. If something ever happens to me, I don't want them going to relatives who don't even know their birthdays. I want them with you." The room spun. "I don't know what to say," Ruth said. "No one's ever trusted me like that." Edward stepped closer. "You've earned it, Ruth. Every inch of this trust." She sat down, staring at the papers, a space for her name. Next to Edward Langston's, under legal co-guardian, not maid, not nanny. Mother. That night, Ruth stood in the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not broken. She was not discarded. She was not forgotten. She was rebuilding, with flower-streaked aprons, bedtime lullabies, and the simple miracle of being needed again. But the fear still whispered, "What if this ends? What if you lose it all? What if you're not enough?" She gripped the sink and closed her eyes, and then she heard it. From down the hall, two tiny voices giggling. "Ruth braids better than you," Caleb teased. "No, she bakes better than you," Sophie shot back. A pause. "She loves us," one of them said. "I know." Ruth opened her eyes again. This wasn't about being enough. This was about being present. And she was. Every day. In every way. The next morning, Ruth placed the signed papers on Edward's desk. He looked up, surprised. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Then, almost shyly, he added, "There's more." She raised an eyebrow. "I bought a house," he said. Ruth blinked. "What?" "A new house. Smaller, cozier, closer to the kids' school. It has a garden. And a porch swing." "Why?" "Because I don't want a mansion anymore. I want a home, with you and the kids." Her breath caught. "Ruth," he said softly, "this isn't about saving you. It's about building something with you." Her eyes filled, and she turned away before the tears could fall. "I never thought I'd be asked to stay," she whispered. "Well," he said gently, "I'm not asking you to stay." She turned back, confused. "I'm asking you to belong." That night, Ruth stood in the doorway of Sophie and Caleb's room, watching them sleep. She leaned against the frame, hand over her heart, which beat faster than it had in years, because for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't the woman left behind. She was the woman being chosen. The wedding wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers, no string quartet, no ballroom with 200 guests sipping champagne. It was just a garden. One oak tree. 2 rows of wooden chairs. A breeze carrying the smell of jasmine. And Ruth Delaney, standing under the arch in a pale blue dress, holding the hands of a man who had once been a stranger with 2 wild children and a tired heart. Now, he was her partner, her safe place. Edward Langston wore a simple navy suit. His voice trembled only once during the vows, and it was when he said, "You brought my family back to life." Sophie and Caleb stood beside them, dressed like mini royalty, holding hands, smiling as wide as the Georgia sky. Caleb whispered loudly mid-ceremony, "We're officially a family now, right?" Edward nodded. "We already were." Afterward, they didn't drive away in a limo. They walked home just 5 blocks to their new house, white siding. A yellow front door, a porch swing that groaned gently in the breeze. Inside, a dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and Ruth's famous cinnamon rolls waited on a long wooden table. They ate, they laughed. The kids danced in their socks to old Motown songs, while Ruth and Edward slow danced in the kitchen, barefoot and grinning. There were no photographers, but Ruth remembered every second. A few days later, Ruth sat in her favorite chair by the front window, a book in her lap. The twins were outside, arguing over who could swing higher. Edward was fixing a loose shutter with more enthusiasm than skill. She smiled. Because this was her joy. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. People in the neighborhood began to refer to her as Mrs. Langston. Some knew her story, most didn't. She didn't feel the need to explain anymore. When someone asked if she had children, she simply said, "Yes, two." She didn't explain how they weren't born from her body but from a second chance. From late-night fevers and early morning hugs, from shoe tying and tear drying and story reading, she didn't explain how motherhood had come not through biology but through showing up, through healing, through staying. One Sunday at church, the pastor invited families forward to light candles for those they'd lost and those they'd found. Ruth stood quietly in line, holding Caleb's hand. When it was her turn, she lit 2 candles. One for the woman she used to be, one who gave up everything and was thrown away. And one for the woman she became, the one who rose from it all. Caleb looked up at her. "What are they for?" She squeezed his hand. "For grace," she said, "and for coming home." That night, Ruth wrote something in her journal. She hadn't touched it in years. It read, "There was a time I thought I was ruined, forgotten, that my name only meant pain. But God doesn't discard people, He repurposes them. I wasn't barren. I was being readied. For these children, for this man, for this peace. I didn't get the life I prayed for. I got the life I was meant to build. One ordinary moment at a time." She closed the journal and looked around the room at Sophie, asleep on the couch with a book over her face, at Caleb, building a Lego castle on the floor, at Edward bringing her a blanket like he did every evening. This, she realized, was the love story no one wrote about. No glass slippers, no whirlwind romance, just resilience, loyalty. The kind of love that doesn't shout, but shows up, again, and again, and again. And in the quiet hum of their home, Ruth Delaney, once called barren, once thrown out like trash, finally understood. She had never been empty. She had always been becoming. Life lesson. Inspired by Ruth Delaney's story. Sometimes, life strips us of everything, our titles, our roles, even our dignity. Ruth Delaney lost her career, her marriage, and her place in a family. But what she never lost was her capacity to love, to serve, and to start again. Her journey reminds us that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes through showing up, through making breakfast for children who aren't yours, through staying kind, even when the world calls you worthless. Ruth didn't fight fire with fire. She fought it with quiet strength, with patience, with consistency. And in doing so, she redefined what it means to be a mother, a woman, and a survivor. For older generations who've lived through heartbreak, disappointment, and sacrifice, Ruth's story is a reminder that it's never too late to begin again. That even if you've been discarded, you're not done. You still matter. You still belong. And sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about falling in love, they're about being chosen after you've been broken.